And particularly interesting, I think, is the work, their own research, rather than merely their assembly of data from pre-existing literature. And I'll only have time to tell you about two fascinating bits, one a field study and the other a series of lab experiments. In the field study, letters were sent to hundreds of potential employers around the United States, both in the North and in the South. The letters purported to be job applications. They said, I'm moving to your area, I'm writing to find out whether you have a job available for me. They purported to be from a 27-year-old Michigan man, from American state, who had one blemish on his otherwise very solid record. Here is the way one version of the letter explained the blemish. I've been convicted of manslaughter. I got into a fight with someone who was having an affair with my fiancé. He confronted me in front of my friends at a bar, told everyone that he and my fiancé were sleeping together, laughed at me to my face, and asked me to step outside if I was man enough, and in the ensuing fight, the other guy was killed. The other letter explained that the applicant had stolen a couple of expensive cars at a time when his family particularly needed money. Well, the Southern employers that Nisbet and Cohen wrote to were much more likely to be sympathetic in response to the manslaughter incident than the car theft incident, but car theft letter. But there was no similar disparity in the Northern employers. And just to give you some idea of what we're talking about in terms of, these were independently coded and what have you, but here's one example of what it is to be sympathetic. Remember, this is somebody who killed somebody in a parking lot fight. As for your problems in the past, anyone could probably be in the situation you were in. It was just an unfortunate incident that should not be held against you. Your honesty shows you are sincere. I wish you the best of luck for the future. You have a positive attitude and a willingness to work. These are qualities that businesses look for in potential employees. No Northern employer was anywhere nearly so sympathetic. Okay, well, let me now tell you about the laboratory study. These were conducted on white, male, mostly upper middle class students, undergraduate students at the University of Michigan, and these students were some from the North and some from the South, so some culture of honor and some not, if this hypothesis is correct. So subjects were told initially, we're going to take a saliva sample to measure blood sugar before you perform a variety of tasks. So saliva sample is taken, then they walk down a long hall, and in this long, narrow hall, there is a Confederate, a big football player who's trained to play this role, and the Confederate bumps into the person, apparently accidentally, and then mumbles very loudly under his breath, "asshole." Okay. After that, they get to the other end of the hall, a second saliva sample is taken, and the saliva samples are tested for cortisol, which is associated with stress, and for testosterone, which is associated with dominance behavior and aggression. And this is one of my favorite slides ever. As you can see here, the Northern non-culture of honor subjects basically didn't react at all, and the Southerners had a surge of testosterone and a surge of cortisol, and we're talking now in seconds, 30 seconds after the bumping. Well, I'm inclined to think that these findings suggest that moral attitudes about the appropriateness of violence in response to insults will not converge even under idealized circumstances, and that therefore these kinds of disagreements are in fact fundamental, in my terms, moral disagreements. To see why, the data don't immediately speak for themselves, since they weren't designed to test this hypothesis, but consider some of the standard, what's often called in the literature, diffusing explanations, explanations of, that could be used by a moral realist to argue, yes, there's disagreement, but it's not really fundamental. Okay? Well, one kind of disagreement, one kind of move is that the disagreement is really caused or sustained by disagreement about relevant non-moral facts. Indeed, this is really the big weapon of the moral realist in trying to rebut cases like this. But in these cases, it's hard to see what those non-moral facts might be. In particular, the one that you might think of first, namely religious disagreements, we know to be false. There were no systematic religious differences between the northern population and the southern population. Nor is there any reason to think, I mean, maybe this isn't a serious suggestion, but could it be that the northerners don't know that being called an asshole is an insult? No, although we don't have data for that. I'm just speculating. Okay. Now, of course, it's always possible that there's an unsuspected systematic difference in belief between these two populations. Even the 3 or 4 or 5 bits of data that Nisbet and Cohen assembled don't begin to exhaust the possible disagreements that might be lurking there. But I think at this point, the burden of argument surely falls squarely on those who want to deny that the moral disagreements about the appropriateness of violence between culture of honor folks in the American South and non-culture of honor folks in the American North is people who wanted to deny that that disagreement is fundamental. Well, another diffusing explanation that might be suggested here is that one group or other fails to be impartial. Remember, it's factual disagreement or non-moral disagreement, partiality or irrationality. Those are the big 3 in characterizing idealized circumstances. But as John Doris and Alex Plakias say in a recent paper, there seems no reason to think that the Southerners' economic interests are more served or are served by being quick on the draw, while Northerners' economic interests are served by turning the other cheek. There looks to be no obvious partiality here. It looks to be the wrong notion to apply to. Well, what about irrationality? Could it be that one group or the other is irrational? Here, of course, we have a hotly contested notion. And in particular, there are both thin and thick accounts of rationality. On a thin account of rationality, and of course, spelling this out in detail is a major project, but on a thin account of rationality, it's tied to logic, probability, decision theory. So you are thinly rational to the extent that your belief formation and your decision making coheres with the principles of logic, probability theory, statistics, decision theory. Thick rationality, on the other hand, is a harder notion to characterize, but there are apparently, I don't believe there is such a thing as thick rationality. I think it's a confused notion, but the people who invoke this notion think that there are certain kinds of preferences which, regardless of the reason for them, are intrinsically irrational. Well, it's, I think, singularly implausible that the Northerners and the Southerners disagree on thin rationality. There's absolutely no reason to suspect that. They might, of course, disagree on thick, they might, of course, differ on rationality if you have a thick interpretation of rationality, because, after all, Southerners voted for George Bush, and that indicates that they are obviously irrational. But of course, as this example illustrates, thick interpretations of rationality are themselves normatively loaded, so in this debate, they're question-begging. All right, so I told you I was going to tell you about 3 projects in this part of the talk. And the third is some of the work that I've been involved with a gaggle of friends and collaborators. Because John Doris is the main figure up there. Kai Ping Peng is the main person doing the work that I'll tell you about in China. Okay, this work was inspired by Nisbet's work, but not the culture of honor stuff, another branch of what Nisbet is doing. Nisbet, in more recent work, reports, or claims at least, to have evidence that East Asian cultures, so EA is East Asian up there, East Asian cultures are more collectivist than Western W cultures, which are more individualist. The East Asian conception of a person, according to Nisbet, but relying on a lot of other very rich and significant literature, the work of Hazel Marcus and Kitayama and others, the East Asian conception of the person emphasizes the social role of that person, mother, teacher, and so on, and de-emphasizes context-independent attributes like being honest or gregarious. Right? This suggests, at least, that East Asians would take a harsher view of transgressions that are destructive of collective or group ties, and a more lenient view of transgressions that benefit, or actions that benefit, the group. So that was our motivation. Now note, if that's right, that is to say, if these deep psychological differences in one's conception of what it is to be a person, or what's important about being a person, have significant impact on moral judgments, then it's very plausible, I think, that the resulting disagreement is fundamental.